What's up? Welcome back. So I did mention I wanted to talk about the Ubisoft thing, and let's talk about the Ubisoft thing. Ubisoft CEO admits they blew it with Breakpoint. I'm looking at a couple articles from PC Gamer and Andy Chalk here. We were wrong in our assumptions. Yesterday was a big day for Ubisoft and not at all a good one. The publisher announced delays to multiple big games, including Watch Dogs Legion, Rainbow Six Quarantine, and Gods and Monsters, which collectively took a big toll on Ubisoft's bottom line for the fiscal year. Another contributing factor to Ubi's financial woes, and part of the reason for all of the delays, was a thundering failure of Ghost Recon Breakpoint and to a lesser extent, The Division 2. Ubisoft didn't provide numbers, but said that it had made a sharp downward revision in the revenues expected from both games, which it blamed on a failure to differentiate Breakpoint from its predecessor, an overall lack of interest in sequels to live games, and excess bugs for the game's failure. In a post-announcement conference call, Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot made the point that while Breakpoint will naturally be compared to Ghost Recon Wildlands, it's not a fair comparison because Wildlands has had years to get its act together. That's a lesson that applies to live games across the board. Sequels to live games cannot be handled in the same way as they are with standard start-to-finish games. We continue to learn and adapt to the realities of live operations, and what we just experienced is that it is more difficult to create interest for a sequel of a successful live multiplayer game when the past iteration has benefited from years of optimization and improvements, Guillemot said. With so many learnings and built-in confidence from our teams, we wrongly believe that after a 30 to 36 month gap between releases, players would be ready to enjoy new adventures of our live games. In the end, it proved too short a time frame. So there's a lot to unpack here. And this is just the top half of this thing. Okay. First of all, publisher announcing delays to multiple big games. Basically, all of these were coming out within the first half of next year, I believe. Almost all of them were. I know Watch Dogs Legion had already been delayed a couple times. I think Rainbow Six was scheduled to be kind of early. Gods and Monsters I'm not too familiar of. But all those are getting pushed back to late 2020, 2021 is what was in the Ubisoft report that they mentioned. And this is all stemming from not the critical panning of Breakpoint, but the lack of sales for Breakpoint and the Division 2. So all of the microtransactions, the store, the skill boosts and time savers and all that shit, those don't matter if you think about it from a corporate perspective where money and hitting quarterly goals for investors is the sole purpose. That's all that matters. People were upset about it, and maybe that led to a decline in the amount of people that purchased the product. But if you look at the Star Wars games, there was a huge amount of backlash to that, but the game still sold very, very, very well. So regardless of how the gamers might be upset with all the loot boxes and how there's no cosmetic stuff and how the game doesn't really have a lot of content and all that shit in it, talking about Battlefront 2, the fact is it sold very well for EA. Now, the back-end stuff, totally separate issue, but the game by itself sold very well. So Breakpoint maybe hit a literal breakpoint with the audience where all of that negative stuff led to it not selling that well, or maybe it was in part of, okay, Wildlands had a very bad launch, and yeah, you did update it over the course of time to where it was kind of better, but all of the footage we've seen about Breakpoint from E3 and other press conferences after that was not really that great. The Ubisofting of every single game with loot and levels and skills and abilities and all that shit maybe didn't lend itself very well to Breakpoint, and maybe didn't lend itself very well to a first impression of Breakpoint. Now, the Division 2, I think the issue with the Division 2 is kind of similar to Breakpoint to an extent, in that it's it's hard to get people excited. What he says here, we wrongfully believe that after a 30 to 36 month gap between releases, players would be ready to enjoy new adventures in our live games. In the end, it proved too short a time frame. I don't think this is actually correct thinking, but I don't have all the data and the numbers that they do. Maybe it truly is a matter of how short it came out. But The Division upon launch also had a very bad and troubled launch. There wasn't a lot of content. There was a lot of bugs. I think the dark zones and a bunch of other shit like just didn't even work for a lot of the time. People were falling through the maps, just typical Ubisoft stuff. So for someone who doesn't invest themselves into one of their games, like we'll just use The Division as an example, for someone who doesn't invest themselves into one of their live service games to see it evolve and grow over the course of time, to see the patches and the evolutions and the bug fixes and the new content that gets added months after months after months after months, I look at it and go, okay, Division 1, I played the beta and I thought it was kind of boring and generic and it like had a lot of bugs and issues to it. So when the game launched, I didn't purchase it. So when the Division 2 launched, it was like, okay, I'm not going to get this. That has to be a way other people feel about Wildlands and thus Breakpoint, especially when all of the critical reception to Breakpoint, all of the early access reviews to Breakpoint is about how this game is rife with bugs, how it's basically unplayable, how it's boring, how there's monetization and microtransactions out the ass throughout the entirety of this game. Now, maybe this is true, right? Maybe this is true as well. Maybe in an alternate reality, let's say Breakpoint didn't have any of the microtransaction stuff and didn't have any bugs, just magically. Would it still be a game people wanted? Or would they still say, the game doesn't have any bugs, good, Ubisoft learned their lesson, but it's still boring. And it still takes forever to fly around, and you don't even have co-op teammates to like have some sort of banter, so it's completely barren and quiet the whole way through. The dialogue isn't that well delivered. I don't really know what the issues are, but even if the game wasn't buggy and didn't have microtransactions, would people still not enjoy that game? There's so many factors that go into this that it's hard to single it to a single thing. It's hard to say, okay, if you released Breakpoint in a year, would that have magically solved all the issues? Because I don't particularly think that it would have. And furthermore, if you have a game that makes a good first impression or even a middling first impression, but across the board shows that it's really evolved and really leveled up, then that makes a perfect springboard for people to get excited about a sequel. If you think about Rainbow Six Quarantine, a lot of people are probably excited for that game. I'm excited for that game because of the positive experience I've had with Rainbow Six Siege after launch, right? Like I'm talking about Rainbow Six Siege now. If Wildlands had hit that same level of public perception and how good it was and how new content is driving people back and how it has a thriving community, then Breakpoint would have had a better starting point. But as it is, Wildlands really didn't hit a super high zenith in a Tom Clancy game, really didn't hit a new zenith in Ghost Recon stuff either. So, yeah, I can completely understand how Breakpoint doesn't sell that well, and to a lesser extent, The Division 2. Now, delaying almost everything that you have, I think is smart. I just think basically every game Ubisoft has put out like in the past 5 years or more has basically always run into the same issues of it's a buggy piece of shit and there's a huge day one patch and then over the course of time the bugs get fixed and then it kind of gets to a playable state and then hopefully they grow from there with more content, more DLCs, more stuff being added in later. But basically, same thing with Bethesda. Like on launch, every Ubisoft game is a piece of shit, more or less. So Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what the issue is. I'm glad that they're taking more time for all of these games, but I don't necessarily think this is something to be put on the players. Like, the players weren't ready for a new game. I don't think you can kind of shoulder the blame on the people not being ready for some of the new great changes we've made to Breakpoint. I don't think that's correct here. He also acknowledged that Breakpoint blew it fair and square in multiple ways too. Changes to basic elements of gameplay is one issue in particular. Ubisoft has generally had success evolving its various franchises over the years, but some of those changes can be unsettling and require perfect implementation in order to offer an optimal experience. To be honest, this sentence doesn't mean really anything to me. Ubisoft has generally had great success evolving its various franchises over the years. I would kind of disagree with that premise innately. And then the actual quote from Guillemot, I would disagree with that too. Over the course of time, every Ubisoft game has basically evolved into the same game, with a few outliers like Starlink, For Honor, and Rainbow Six. But every Assassin's Creed game has kind of become an amalgam of every Far Cry game, which is now becoming an amalgam of every Ghost Recon game, right? It was a joke a decade ago about how every Ubisoft game was getting the towers, right? Every Ubisoft game had you climb up a tower to reveal a new part of the map to fill in new side quests and shit to do. And like, regardless of how well the implementation was, that was basically a meme of how every Ubisoft game is literally the same game, just with a new paint job over it. So I don't feel like they are really evolving and growing in new, unique ways. I think almost every Ubisoft game is basically a loot, open world, semi-open world game, like with levels and skills and abilities, and you just kind of change the main character and the story and add some other shit in there. This has not been the case with Ghost Recon Breakpoint. We didn't have a perfect implementation to offer an optimal experience. The changes we brought to its core gameplay have generated a very negative reaction. Now, some of the changes they added to this were, depending on what he's referencing, the microtransaction for literally everything. Keep in mind, this game has microtransactions for weapons, for skins, for costumes, for abilities, for level ups. They took those out, but they were in there for a limited period of time. Literally everything in the game you can purchase. While the change of formula has been... and also the introduction of basically everything that the Division 2 and Far Cry and Assassin's Creed has, which is loot and levels up and level ups and skills and sort of a social hub world. I don't think Far Cry and Assassin's Creed have that, but the Division, which was released later, has something like that. While the change in formula has been very well received by some players, as average daily playtime per player is very strong at more than 3 hours, this, I think, is meaningless. It also has been rejected by an important portion of the community. The daily playtime per player is very strong at more than 3 hours. This sentence in and of itself is meaningless in that we have no idea of how many people are playing it. This sentence could literally, if you take it to the extreme, could mean there's one dude who plays the game for 3 hours and 30 minutes whenever he logs on. It's hard to really understand what that means. Okay, when people play Breakpoint, they play it for a long time. Well, maybe they're just playing it for a long time to record footage, to put up a review, and then they never touch the game again. Maybe looking at the accounts, they don't actually repeatedly log in. It's just everyone logged in at launch, made their videos, made their footage, streamed it on Twitch, got their footage, and then left. And you also have to take into account the people who kind of went overboard on it, like 24-hour Breakpoint streams and things like that, which completely skew that number. It's also been rejected by an important portion of the community. Again, there's no metrics here. There's no data here. How big of a percentage is he talking about? Or is this some like marketing speech where he's talking about influencers aren't really playing the game anymore? It's hard to really know. You have to imagine not as many people are playing this, which led to Breakpoint not selling as well because all the critical reception was bad, which ultimately led to them delaying everything. Hey, we just didn't make enough money from this. That's ultimately what's driving all these changes. Interestingly, he also admitted that Ubisoft rolled the dice a bit by releasing Breakpoint while it was still suffering from some known technical issues. This doesn't seem like rolling the dice. Every single game Ubisoft releases has known technical issues. They weren't blockers, Guillemot said, and Ubisoft was confident that what it perceived to be small flaws were easily outweighed by the overall quality of the co-op campaign, which was why it was so surprised when that turned out to not be the case. So there are known shippable bugs in games. Every game has known shippables. Basically, it's a bug that doesn't brick the system, that doesn't break the game. That's okay. We can still go gold, print discs, ship it out, move copies of the game, let people preload it while this bug is in play, because it's not either that big of a deal or we don't have the resources to fix it, and it doesn't completely break the game. So shipping a game with blockers or what I was saying earlier, bugs that are like known shippables is fine. Confident that what it perceived to be small flaws were easily outweighed by the overall quality of the co-op campaign. This, I don't know, because basically everyone that had tested the game, that had footage of the game, that reviewed the game early, that got a copy early, that did all that shit, I think basically from E3 onwards, everyone's perception of this game was bad. So we can separate known shippables from this, but hey, we have some small flaws that's easily outweighed by the overall quality of the co-op campaign. Now, you do have to keep in mind the same thing with Bethesda, which you kind of have to challenge with the release of Outer Worlds being as basically as clean as it is. But every Bethesda game has numerous bugs, millions of bugs. But the overall quality of the game is still there. Okay, yeah, of course Skyrim is completely fucked and every save and every item is going to add on to itself and completely brick your system after a while, but it's fine. But it's easily outweighed by the overall quality of the co-op campaign. This I'm not sure of because all of the critical perception was that this game was bad when it was first announced anyway. What we see now is that with the response from players, we were wrong in our assumptions, he said. Watch Dogs Legion, Rainbow Six Quarantine, and Gods and Monsters are now all expected to arrive sometime in Q2, Q3 of Ubisoft's next fiscal year, which puts them between July 1st and December 31st of 2020. Beyond that, it sounds like Ubisoft experience with Breakpoint means we'll be waiting longer than usual for its next round of live games. We need to make sure that for live multiplayer games, there is sufficient time between each iteration received to build strong anticipation and momentum. We need to make sure that all our upcoming productions benefit from enough development time. This has been a strategy for many years and it has proven very effective. This situation is telling us we cannot make exceptions. Again, this all comes down to how well you actually treat the game, how well the first impression of the game is, if you even get a chance to grow it after that. While Rainbow Six Siege has completely done a 180 and changed course, For Honor has gotten a ton of updates, but I don't see a growing community around For Honor. If you remember when For Honor released, it was peer-to-peer. There were no dedicated servers, right? And it was not unplayable, but basically unenjoyable for a large portion of people in lobbies, a la everyone except for the host. Now, eventually, they added dedicated servers, and they've basically been adding new characters and new content every couple months since the game's release, but it hasn't completely changed perception of that game and gotten people super excited to get back into For Honor. They had their time with it and then they moved on. Rainbow Six is basically the only game I can really think of that this Ubisoft Live experience has really grown and blown up in a way that no one could have ever expected. And from a business perspective, releasing a new Assassin's Creed game, releasing a new Call of Duty game every single year makes sense. People keep buying it. It makes a fuck ton of money. So you'd be dumb to not do it, even if the quality of the game suffers. There's so many people buying it. You make millions and millions and millions of dollars by releasing it at this time every single year. The actual audience hasn't voted with their wallets, per se, to force you to not make a change. Now, if Call of Duty had a horrible launch, a completely horrible launch, and didn't sell enough copies, they probably would have come out with something similar to this. Okay, regardless of what the critics say, regardless of what the audience says, regardless of that we have like a 50 on Metacritic and a 30 from the user score, that doesn't matter. All that really matters is how many copies were sold, how much microtransactions have occurred, how much money did this game generate. And it's clear now that this game didn't generate enough money, thus the entire company is shifting the way they do business moving forward. And I think this is good. I think more development time is innately good, in my opinion. But furthermore, giving your team enough time to really differentiate what game they're making. It's not just another Assassin's Creed game. It's not just another Ubisoft game and we throw these same characters onto it. We can actually try new things and not have every game be, okay, a watchtower, fill in a portion of the map. Here's a bunch of side quests. Here's some skills that you fill out. Here's some perk points and other shit like that. Or now every game has level ups and items and equipment points and all that shit. But this other game, this other article I wanted to talk about, this one too, because it kind of ties into that. Watch Dogs Legion was slated to come out on March 6th, 2020. The company announced that it will instead be releasing sometime during the company's 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, which begins on April 1st. The delay announcements were accompanied by a significant reduction in financial targets for this fiscal year, from a previous target of $2.42 billion to $1.61 billion. The downturn was attributed to the loss of expected revenues from Legion, Quarantine, and Gods and Monsters in this fiscal year, as well as a sharp downward revision in the revenues expected from Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and to a lesser extent, The Division 2. Ubisoft CEO acknowledged that those two games fell far short of expectations. So they are saying that games that aren't even released are going to sell less than what they expected because of how bad Ghost Recon Breakpoint sold, and to a lesser extent, The Division 2. This is a huge difference, 2.4 billion to 1.6 billion. That is a huge drop in monetary value from that, and could most definitely lead to a complete overhaul and restructuring of the way games are developed and push out and marketed and when they're given enough time. This is basically the first time I can remember something like this happening. Some company coming up and basically saying, yeah, we completely fucked up to such an extent that our entire pipeline needs to be changed. I remember, I think 2, 3, 4 years ago, one of the studios came out and said, hey, we can't be releasing this game every year. We're going to be releasing it every other year. But it wasn't attributed to this large of a financial hit. This is the first time I can remember something like this. For Ghost Recon Breakpoint, while the game's quality appeared on track, again, for him, keep in mind, maybe it was on track, but for everyone else, this game already didn't look super great. First impressions weren't awesome for this game. Based on E3, Gamescom previews, and our latest internal playtest, critical reception and sales during the game's first week were very disappointing. As we have done with past titles, we will continue to support the game and listen to the community in order to deliver the necessary improvements. Like, from his perspective, again, sure, this game seems right on track with our established pipeline. We have a certain amount of bugs, a certain amount of issues, a certain amount of dev time. There's essentially like a triangle that you have, and you have to basically put time and quality and money on the different like apexes of that triangle, and you only get 2 of them. So if we have a specific time that the game needs to be released, you can't fudge that. Okay, time is locked in, and we only have this much money with which to develop the game. So time is locked in, and to a lesser extent, the money is locked in. So you're willing to give up the quality of the game, right? As opposed to, okay, quality is the number one thing, which means we don't have a set release date for this. And thus, okay, quality and money are the 2 things that we really care about. And time, when it's done, it's done. From his perspective, the game is right on track with what they already have, what their pipeline is. But everyone else thought it was bad, which led to not as enough people purchasing the game. But he said Breakpoint stumbled for 3 main reasons. Interest in sequels to live multiplayer games is limited. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's only limited if you leave a bad impression in people's mouths. It's only limited if the game doesn't leave a good impression. If you have a game that's a 10 out of 10 in people's hearts and minds, that's an amazing experience, that had a great launch, that you've supported for a year or 2 years or 3 years, and the game has only grown better and more content's been added and more ease of use and more quality of life things have been added into the game. And the game launched here, and then it rose up and hit this point, and now you're launching a sequel that's starting from here. Okay, we've learned over the past 2 to 3 years on what we did wrong, what we did right, what new changes we made, what things you didn't like, what things you did like, and we've learned from those lessons, and here's blank 2. Here's Destiny 2 is a kind of good example for this. People are very excited for that. This game left a great impression. This game is saying that it's learned from all of the lessons from the previous game, and it's only going to get better. I'm very excited for this. The problem is when you don't let your games fully bake in the oven before pushing them out, and you kind of support them in the Anthem sense. Okay, this game is going to be a live service that's supported for years to come. Okay, but the user base isn't really there, so we're actually not going to support the game anymore. Hey guys, Anthem 2 is announced. Who's excited for it? Like, really no one. But if you properly support the game, then people are excited for the sequel. So I don't really agree with this. Gameplay innovations in Breakpoint were not perfectly implemented. This is the quote from earlier. The gameplay innovations, I disagree with this. I think gameplay innovations in Ubisoft terms is essentially loot, levels, skill points, social hub, and microtransactions. And that's kind of it. There's no really completely unique systems being implemented in Breakpoint. If you can remember Arkham Asylum's combat, right? How that's a gameplay innovation. Or Shadow of Mordor, like the Nemesis system. That was a gameplay innovation. There's really no gameplay innovations in Ubisoft games for a long time. I mean, the naval combat was kind of cool. I would say that's a gameplay innovation. And it did not come in well enough and it did not come in with enough differentiation factors, which prevented the game's intrinsic qualities from standing out. I would agree with this to the extent that the fact that the game was so buggy and bad and boring meant that the game couldn't really shine. If everything about the game was fixed, there was no microtransaction shop in this magical world, and there were no bugs to the game, and it worked perfectly, then people would judge it based on how good it was, as opposed to every headline being this game is completely fucked and there's microtransactions out the ass and it's broken and it's unplayable, right? Like, then you would just judge the game based on how good it actually was. You can't keep punching out same looking sequels to live multiplayer games and expect to get away with it forever. In other words, especially when they're not in absolutely tip-top technical shape when they go out the doors, which Breakpoint was not. That's part of what motivated Ubisoft to pump the brakes on Legion and the rest. While each of these games already has a strong identity and high potential, we want our teams to have more development time to ensure that their respective innovations are perfectly implemented so as to deliver optimal experiences for players. This decision will have a very significant impact on our financial results for this fiscal year and goes against our recent successes in building a more stable development model. However, it is in line with our strategy to maximize the future value of our brands for the long-term benefit of our employees, players, and shareholders. Okay, so this was Assassin's Creed. I thought it was Assassin's Creed, but I didn't want to say it without being sure. Ubisoft took a year off and came back with Assassin's Creed Origins, one of the strongest games in the series. Like this... where he says this goes against our recent successes in building a more stable development model. I don't work at Ubisoft. I don't know what their sort of pipeline is for development, but I can't imagine every game was a recent success, right? The past two games, Breakpoint was a horrible launch. Division 2 already undersold. Assassin's Creeds are okay, and Far Cry I think kind of got panned because it was more or less more of the same. And then the sort of mini Far Cry that came out was basically a reskin of Far Cry 5, and I think that didn't really do that well either. So I'm not entirely sure what he's saying here. It goes against our recent successes in building a more stable development model. In my opinion, the more stable development model is what you're going to be instituting now after learning that you can't release a game every year or every year and a half or every 2 years half-baked without really fully developing the previous game, without reaching a good endpoint with the previous game, taking all those lessons, consolidating them, figuring out what actually worked, what didn't work, what do we need to move on from, and then making another game. The Division 1 is at an entirely different state than the Division 1 when it launched. And if the Division 2 had incorporated all of those lessons, then it could have been a totally different conversation. I think more or less the issue with Division 2 was that kind of the builds are quite similar. It's just, you just build damage. There's no skill builds really to speak of. There's no really tanking builds to speak of. They split up the dark zones, which was not in the Division 1. I think you just had 1 or 2 dark zones that was like a main focus. In this one, there's multiple different areas there. A lot of the stats on loot and stuff doesn't really matter. The end game isn't really there for the Division 2. There's one raid. So I kind of disagree with what he's saying. We have a more stable development model. I'm excited to see how everything being pushed back helps the development of those games. And I'm excited to see if hopefully because of the significant impact that the delay had on Legion, Gods and Monsters, and Quarantine, if that forces them to really stick to that model moving forward. Okay, we saw a significant jump in sales for Watch Dogs Legion as opposed to Watch Dogs 2 and the original one, that we've decided moving forward, our new pipeline is going to be that we give each game an extra 12 months or an extra 6 months of dev cycle for this. But yeah, both of these articles were from Andy Chalk from PC Gamer. It was just interesting. I wanted to talk about it. I hope that not every Ubisoft game feels the same moving forward. I do think they have good tech. Like the platform that the games are built on, I think is good. It's just, can they really differentiate themselves, and can they really evolve into new gameplay focuses and features given the appropriate amount of dev time? I think squashing every game down to every year and a half forces them into a position of, okay, we just got to copy 25% of what this game did in order to fill that out so we can start from here, which led to every game having watchtowers, every game having like side quests, and not side quests, but every game having like that same feel to it. When you have a rushed dev cycle, you kind of have to copy and paste stuff to really hit the ground running. You don't have enough time to really develop everything from scratch organically and see where that takes you. But yeah, that's it. Ubisoft. Interesting that Breakpoint sold so badly that the CEO actually went out and took credit for it to investors and said that we're going to make some significant changes to our pipeline. That's kind of the first real mention of that I can think of. So that's it. Bye.